Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm here to look ahead to Newcastle United's home Premier League game against Manchester City tomorrow at St James's Park. I would also look at a couple of what are really big news stories from the last couple of days. We've had Eddie Howe's news conference this morning with a few difficult updates on injuries, which we'll get into. But also CEO Darren Eales has done a couple of interviews explaining the FFP situation and a few home truths about where Newcastle stand in that regard. And I've done a video on that this week earlier on, regarding Bruno Guimaraes and links to PSG and where Newcastle stand on the potential need to sell some players to grow their revenue streams. They obviously have done that. There's been a 40% increase, as Darren Eales has talked about, but there's also a £70 million loss as well. Newcastle still need to bridge gaps to rivals in the transfer window. As I alluded to in that video, they are the only team, I think, who are trying to shop at a different market, different level than their sort of financial picture actually allows. Get into that in a bit. First of all, we'll start with the injury updates from Eddie Howe's news conference this morning. As promised, Joelinton picked up a thigh injury against Sunderland and is unfortunately going to be missing for 6 weeks, and that's a huge blow. I think not just in terms of it being another long-term injury in a season which has been absolutely peppered with them, but it's that player specifically. Joelinton is a player who brings a different dimension to Newcastle's team overall. Their midfield is much more physical, much more imposing. There's a lot more dynamism when he plays in the whole team. He really sets a tone for that midfield, which sets a tone for the whole team. So it's going to be a huge blow to miss him. On top of that, Joe Willock, who's another player who does very similar job in a different way, is another player who's not got a date to come back yet. Harvey Barnes has been out with a toe injury for a few months. No return date yet set for him. Elliot Anderson's back problem continues. No return date set for him. The one player that there was a timescale on that Eddie Howe mentioned was Callum Wilson, who he hopes will be back by the end of this month. But a lot of the players that we were hoping would come back have now not. It doesn't seem that they're as far along on that process, and I can understand why that's incredibly frustrating for supporters who have really had to get used to this injury situation, on top of a very difficult January window where very little's going to happen in terms of incomings for various different reasons. As I say, I did mention this in my video earlier on this week, but do go check that out if you haven't already seen it. A lot of fans of other clubs and external media have seen that video from Darren Eales and sort of jumped on the idea that Newcastle will have to sell their best players. And while I think they're open to any possibility to close the gap on those clubs, as I've mentioned, and Eddie Howe didn't deny that, you know, the likes of Bruno and Botman and Isak might need to be sold one day to close that gap. That isn't the aim. That isn't the point of what Newcastle are trying to do. They're not literally sitting here and thinking we're going to sell our best players. Our plan is to sell Bruno or Isak or Botman, but they are looking at different possibilities, and that is the quickest route to gaining that extra money to close that gap. Yes, the revenue streams are bigger. The Champions League will help for the next year on that front. Whether they get back into Europe again will define how much that helps as well. Extra sponsorships, they are growing. There's a 40% increase year on year since the takeover in that sense, but they're still nowhere near Tottenham, let alone Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal and Manchester City. City's revenue is 700 million, who Newcastle play this weekend, and I think that really shows the gulf that they face, and that unfortunately means that you can't rule out selling a player like Bruno. And I do think, as I said, the reason that there's a release clause in his contract is because it comes down to guaranteeing a fee that will really help with the profits. It doesn't mean that Newcastle are looking for that profit actively. It doesn't mean that Bruno is looking for an exit actively, but it just kind of really makes sure that any sale suits both parties, and I think there's nothing really wrong with that. So these things can be taken out of context. I saw somebody saying that Chelsea should pounce on Alexander Isak for £70 million because Newcastle need the money. That's absolutely not the case. It's just a case of whether they make tough decisions in the same way that Aston Villa have used a sale to bring in extra players and improve their team. Liverpool obviously sold Philippe Coutinho and brought in Alisson Becker and Virgil van Dijk. Manchester City in the past have sold players when they want to go and use that money in profit to strengthen their hand. There's a lot of reasons to sell a player. It isn't just the need. It isn't just against club's will. These player trading is the sort of thing that Newcastle will have to do. But it also doesn't mean that it has to be Bruno Isak and Botman. It could also be Jacob Murphy, Miguel Almiron. As I alluded to at the end of that video, somebody like Sean Longstaff, who will guarantee 100% profit because he's an academy graduate. I don't like the fact that FFP rewards clubs for selling academy graduates, but that's just the reality of the situation, that Newcastle will benefit if they sell somebody like a Longstaff more than they would if they sold somebody like an Almiron, for example. So those tough decisions might have to be made at some stage, but I think you can tell that it will only be made if it benefits Newcastle. One player that has been linked this week and is not on the radar because of affordability, and that's another reason why these rumours and this talk and this discourse has developed, is Dominic Solanke from Bournemouth. Now, Eddie Howe says he loves the player. He signed him for Bournemouth, and there's a lot of obviously split opinion among the fans as to whether he's the right type of player and the right level of player for Newcastle. I can understand why people would be unhappy with Dom Solanke coming in, because he's a 26-year-old player who's only really having his first breakout season in the Premier League. There's not, if Newcastle are going to sign players to grow and become better players, they need to look for repeating the deals for the likes of Isak, Botman and Bruno, who have got real reputations on the European continent or in the UK at a young age, like Anthony Gordon, for example, rather than somebody who's 26 and only just coming into a level that you might consider being good enough for Newcastle. But the real reason that this is news is because Newcastle can't afford it. But it comes down to the fact that Newcastle are never going to be in the market for a £50 million striker, and that's what it'll unfortunately cost. Why would Bournemouth want to sell their best striker when they're enjoying such a good season under Andoni Iraola right now? They have ambitions for themselves, so it's a difficult market to sign anybody in, and I think Newcastle would have better hope of signing someone like Solanke in the summer. I also think that their level of target grows in the summer as well, and they have longer to consider players. So I don't think that Solanke is a main target for Newcastle. They haven't made an inquiry, according to Eddie Howe, but I wouldn't get too bogged down in the idea that they can't spend the money that's needed, because that's always been the case this month. It's going to be a loan deal. The reason for that is because from a Newcastle perspective, more beneficial business, better business can be done in the summer, and admittedly it's looking less likely now, but players are coming back from injury, so they've taken a calculated risk with this window, and whether you like it or not, it's going to be a quiet one, unfortunately. As for this game at the weekend against Manchester City, apparently there's no Erling Haaland for City as well, which is a huge thing for Newcastle going into the game. Kevin De Bruyne will be back. I think it'll be a draw. I think Newcastle will take some confidence from the Sunderland game. A draw would be a good result, a good building block on that result going into what is a very tough game against Aston Villa before the fixtures sort of ease out in February. City are getting to that point where they're going to start racking up their performances and racking up those results. So it's going to be a very tough game. Newcastle don't want to lose 2 home games on the bounce for the first time in a long time. So I think a draw will be a good result for Newcastle. It's whether they can match their intensity and physicality without Joelinton. I would expect Louis Miley to come back in as a replacement. Anthony Gordon looks fit again after that brilliant performance last week. I think it's a massive shame that Joelinton's not fit, because he was so good against Sunderland as well. That's the other thing. He was the player who, for me, was the standout in that first half and really set that tone. And then up front, Alexander Isak is looking finally back to something akin to his best. He's another player who's played a lot of games and played through injuries, so finally he looks back to his best. There are a lot of reasons to be positive. I don't think the FFP situation and the Dom Solanke situation is really reflective of the current mood at Newcastle. I think there's a lot more to be positive about overall. I just think that the thing to remember is if Newcastle do sell any key players, whether it be on the Longstaff level or the Almiron level or the Murphy level or the Isak, Botman, Bruno level, it'll be done on their terms with their idea in place of how to move the club forward. Thanks very much for joining me. I'll be back next week to look back at this game, but also with another transfer update, any more information that I do have and thoughts I do have. So please continue to like, share and subscribe if this is the sort of thing you like, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.